So today we have Lois Thetford. She's the co-chair of maternal child health at Medics and the founder of 45th Street Clinic. Over 23 years, she has worked with the homeless along with battered women and children. And in 2013, she was a recipient of the Medics Lifetime Achievement Award. So if everyone can please welcome Lois Thetford.
So today in the Seattle Times, the front page has a lengthy article about suburban homelessness. Suburban homelessness is not something that you hear very much about, but they describe homelessness, the number of children in the Redmond School District and in the Lake Washington School District. They have like 227 homeless children within the school district. And so the thing about homelessness is that it happens everywhere. People think of homelessness as single adults who drink or take too much drugs or who are mentally ill and live downtown. But the truth is that there are homeless people here at the University of Washington. They might have a scholarship that pays for their tuition, but they don't have funds to live on. So I've had quite a few of the homeless youth that I have served who have been students right here at UW and also lived homeless. But it does happen everywhere. And there's sort of three main categories of homeless individuals. And so I'm just going to start with children because it's one of the groups that people don't see as often. They don't think of them as often, but there's actually huge numbers of homeless children. So they may be homeless with one parent, sometimes with both parents, sometimes with a grandparent or an aunt or uncle. They live in cars, they live in tents in the National Forest, and they also live in shelter and transitional housing. So one little girl that I was taking care of, so my job was, as a medical provider, to go into battered women shelters, homeless daycares, schools, and do street outreach and work with families who are homeless. I also was the lead for the 45th Street Homeless Youth Clinic for 5 years, the clinical lead, and I helped start the clinic back in 1971. Her name, April, was about 4 and a half. She and her mother actually came here from Birmingham, Alabama. Most homeless people actually were born and grew up here in Washington. So most homeless people are not from somewhere else, but in many situations where there's very dangerous situations of domestic violence, people will cross state lines and go as far away as they can to try to save their own lives and to save the lives of their children. So when I went to the daycare, I would do an intake exam on every child and assess developmental things. Anemia, very common among homeless families and homeless children. So there's lots of sort of simple things that you can do that can really easily improve their overall health. Her family lived at a domestic violence shelter, and this is a locked and confidential facility where you cannot bring friends. You cannot invite friends over after school. You can't tell anyone where you live because it's a security issue. And so that in itself is a stressor for children. So last year, at the one-night count, which is something that's done in every county in all over the state of Washington, but all over the U.S., every county that receives any federal funds related to public health services or other kinds of services for homeless families and individuals of all ages, they have to do the one-night count. So last year at one-night count, there were 3,282 people living in shelters and 2,900, so almost 3,000 people in transitional housing. So women and children make up the majority of transitional housing residents. They move into emergency shelter, and then if they stabilize enough, then they can get into transitional housing. And if they don't stabilize, they just go from emergency to car to a different place and so on. In the US, every year, 1 in 50 American children are homeless. So when children are homeless, they lose their familiar toys, they have to leave their bike behind, they have difficulty with school, they don't have the right clothes, they don't have the right lunchbox. School becomes really complicated and difficult for them, and they tend to avoid school if it's too stressful for them. And so they frequently fall behind in school, but they have a lot of emotional issues that have to be dealt with as well, that really interfere with their being able to learn in the school. So to assess how a family functions, I always ask a couple of different questions, and one of them is, who cooks? And what did they have for dinner last night? So one of the things that often happens in a family that has major dysfunction is that the children are often doing their own cooking. And usually there's rules like you can only cook things in the microwave, you can't use the stove, at least until you're 8. And sometimes they also actually work on getting the food. So we had a family at one of the schools where I was providing services, and the kids would come back to the school and ask for vouchers, and they would ask for food, or they would go around to the kitchen after school, because homeless children get 80% of their food intake from school or daycare. And so for them, a 2-week vacation is not a time of good meals. They actually suffer during a 2-week vacation from school because they're not eating more than once a day, say. And growing children and adolescents, eating once a day is really hard. It's painful. And so they work on getting food from whatever sources they can. And so, sometimes they would try to sneak into the school kitchen from the back door, try to get food to take home. And so there's many aspects to homelessness that are very hard on children. So when I asked April who cooks, she said, I really miss my grandma. She always cooked for us. So she lived in a multi-generational family, and so it's not just that she left her home and her belongings, she left her grandma. But her mom's life was in danger and they had to leave. And so she was carrying all this grief. She was very verbal, very able to talk about things. She obviously had grown up in a situation where she had felt well nurtured and loved, and it was really hard for her to have to leave that. So the way they do the one-night count is very interesting. They go out between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. At the end of January. So this year it was January 29th. And they look everywhere. So bus shelters, they ride the night buses, because some homeless people will ride the night buses in the winter particularly. In abandoned buildings, under bridges, all kinds of places. And the purpose of the one-night count is to try to evaluate how many homeless people there are, what kinds of services they're getting, and what kinds of things they need. So, unfortunately, this year, for people that weren't in shelter, either transitional housing or emergency shelter, there were 4,505 men, women, and children living outside in January, which was a 19% increase from last year. Now, there's been quite a lot of writing in the newspaper about various plans that have been worked out by the mayor with other people, United Way is involved. There are many agencies, many agencies that work on homelessness. There's substance abuse agencies and social work agencies and a lot of medical personnel and dental personnel. I've been to the Mount Vernon place, and I know that you come to the 45th Street Clinic, and our young clients are so grateful. You know, they talk about it. They talk about it to us, and they talk about it among themselves. So a couple of years ago, this young man came in. He was from Alaska, and he was very tentative, but he talked to me. He said, I've heard that you have dentists. And the way that he said dentist, it was like you were saying fairy godmother. Like, I've never seen a dentist, he said. He was 19. I've never seen a dentist. I would really like to see a dentist. And he was so genuine and so sincere, and yet it was sort of like he couldn't imagine ever having the privilege, being in a position where he might really have access to dental care. It was unimaginable previously in his life. There was no access, period. And thus he had never seen a dentist. And so one of the great things for him in coming here was that he heard that we had dental care at the 45th Street Homeless Youth Clinic. And he made it a point to show up on time and be one of the first people there. It was like a magical experience for him. So I want you to know how much the work that you do with people who don't have access really makes a difference. People really, really, really appreciate it. And it makes a lot of difference in their life in general as well. So the one-night count this year counted only 29 people under 18 in the one-night count. And that's because a lot of young people have learned how to hide really well. So there's a completely separate mechanism for counting youth. And it's called Count Us In. So most youth leave home because of physical or sexual abuse, and they fear adults in general, and they really fear adult environments. So they don't feel safe in places where other homeless adults are. So they have their own ways of hiding. Of the youth that I've worked with, some of them lived in the pipes in Guestworks Park. And other very creative and inventive things. So when they do the Count Us In, they go only to youth agencies. And so when they did the Count Us In for this year, they counted 327. So that is clearly that youth don't get counted in the one-night count because they have a really separate realm. So of those, 26% were actually at a shelter on the night of the Count Us In. 216 were unsheltered, so living on the street. And others were in squats or in unstable housing, you know, where there's like 5 or 6 people to a one-bedroom apartment, which is sometimes called doubled up, but really it's quadrupled and pentupled up. And 13% of them were under 18. So of the 327, 111 of the homeless youth that they counted this year were under 18. And that's a particular problem, because in this state, we have a law that says if a person who is under 18 shows up at your shelter, you have to report them within 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours. And so a lot of shelters only take you who are 18 and over. So sometimes I'll be seeing a young person. I saw this young man, he had a really bad case of bronchitis. And I said, I really want you to sleep indoors tonight. We have some beds at the shelter that are reserved for homeless youth from our clinic. So I can get you into the shelter. He said, I can't go to the shelter. I'm only 16. So I'm not eligible to be in the shelter. So it's like, oh, this law, it works against us. And getting into shelter, there's only so many beds, and people line up, and you have to be there at a certain time, and only the first 30 or so get in, and everyone else just has to wander off and find another place to go. But, you know, sometimes if you really push them, say, well, I have a friend, but they live in Federal Way, and I said, okay, we'll give you bus tickets, or, you know, you really have to try to facilitate when a youth is sick, what you can do to get them off the street as quickly as possible, because they're not going to get well that way. The other thing is being in the elements. So, you know, if you're sleeping out, even if you have a sleeping bag, you'll get wet because it's raining. And the feet get wet. So one of the biggest items that we always have on outreach and that we have at the clinic is socks. So periodically we do big sock collections and try to get socks, because otherwise people get really bad infections on their feet, and then it's hard to walk around. All right. The last case I want to talk about is Jorge. Jorge used to be a school teacher in Mexico, but he had a brother in California, and he was able to emigrate legally. But he couldn't get a good job because he wasn't fluent in English and he didn't know the right people. Where he lived in Mexico, he could walk everywhere and eat good food for relatively little money. He said, when I lived in Mexico, I felt wealthy. When I come to the US, I'm homeless. The school where he worked downsized, and his marriage ended, and he decided to emigrate to the US. But he could never afford housing. So he finally got a job where he was driving, but he was driving like 8 to 10 hours a day. During the time that he had this job driving, his diabetes got bad because he wasn't walking everywhere and his diet wasn't good, and so his health deteriorated and his blood pressure went up, and he was still couch surfing among friends. He didn't have his own place. And it was very hard for him to maintain his health. So it was hard to keep track of appointments, to hold on to his medications. It's one of the hardest things about having homeless people who are ill is, you know, you can't give them medication that, you know, needs to be at a certain temperature, because it could be colder or warmer wherever they are. And it's very hard for them to keep track of all of their belongings when they don't have a safe place. As I was walking over here, I was passing those bike boxes, and I'm like, boy, that would be a great place to store all of your belongings of the homeless youth I know. That would be just beautiful. So then he began to have trouble with his eyesight because of his diabetes, and he needed laser treatment. And so he had to stop driving, so then he lost his job, so then he didn't have any income, and he didn't have medical coverage. So part of being homeless is the cascade of things that happen to you. And he was a very intelligent, resilient person who still has a really good sense of humor and a sense of himself, but his health deteriorated, and partly it was just that, you know, he wasn't able to establish a healthy lifestyle. Homelessness is not a healthy lifestyle. One of the problems with being homeless is that you get beat up, you get assaulted. So both men and women, when they are homeless, for women it's a third of all women each year. So if you're homeless 2.5 years, it's like almost 100% that you have been assaulted, physically or sexually. For men, it's mostly physical assault, but there are also sexual assaults. And it's not as high, but it's close. I think it's like 20% per year. So it's and so you have acute injuries, you have chronic illnesses, you have so many things to try to manage in your life. And you know, some people tend to form small groups of support, like they watch each other's stuff and they help protect each other, and that's really important. But some people who have mental illness are very paranoid and don't trust anyone else, and so they may tend to choose only 1 or 2 people to sleep near in order to not feel crowded. So one of the sidelights to this is that part of homelessness is an economic problem. There isn't enough housing, and people can't afford housing. But another part of that is that they tend to be people who don't have a lot of resources. So they don't have other family members they can go live with. They don't have other people in their lives. For example, homeless youth frequently become homeless because of things that happen in their family that really they have no control over. For example, when I also was in the high schools. We have clinics in the high schools. And I was working in one of the high school clinics at Roosevelt. And this young woman came in, and she was having some depression. And I said, so tell me what this is about. And she said, well, my mom is disabled, and she had to move into disabled housing. And in disabled housing, you can only have a guest 10 nights per month. So she was 15 or 16, she was like a sophomore in high school, and 10 nights a month she could stay with her mom, and the rest of the month she was homeless. And she wasn't interested in living on the street, she had no drug or alcohol problems, she had no mental illness. She was a victim of circumstance. And you know, some youth are thrown out, beaten up because they're gay or transgender. Other youth, it's just an abusive situation. Other situations, one of the parents has gone to jail and there's no one to maintain the home. And these children really suffer because of what happens to their parents. And if they don't have a strong extended family, they don't have anyone to turn to. And they end up on the street. So, bankruptcy. You wouldn't necessarily know that bankruptcy is a driver of homelessness, except during the recent depression, when so many people lost housing, foreclosures, jobs, the bankruptcy rate went through the sky. The number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States, medical bills, because we don't have a rational, coordinated medical system, which should also include dental care and mental health at the same level of coverage as medical care. And our system is just set up in this piecemeal way, and even 62% of all personal bankruptcies in the United States are because of medical bills. 62%. And 78% of those people had health insurance. But what happens when you have a catastrophic illness is there's a lifetime limit. Even with good health insurance, they say beyond this amount, we don't pay anything. Well, if you happen to still be alive and need more cancer care, then you end up owing $80,000 or $50,000 or however much it is. And that's just one of the ways that our economic system is completely skewed, in that people should be able to treat illnesses without losing their homes. It's no other civilized country in the world has a system that is so punishing to people who get sick or who have hard times. So that's one of the drivers of homelessness. Among youth, one of the drivers of homelessness is youth who age out of foster care. So once again, these are children who have been put in foster care because their parent was disabled, was in jail, died, whatever happened to them, they weren't there to take care of them. When they get to be 18, the state no longer is responsible for them, and they become homeless in large numbers. So there are certain states and cities and places around the country where groups like the Elks have taken on trying to house kids aging out of foster care. But the truth is that, one charitable organization here or there is not the answer. The answer is that people at 18, for the most part, are not self-supporting. I mean, few of the people in this room probably could have paid all of their expenses for housing and having a car and getting to work without some help at 18. So it's an unreasonable expectation to think that children who have had inconsistent and probably some poor parenting, who are not well adjusted because they haven't had a stable background, are going to be able to go out there, get a job, have an apartment, and be able to live a full life. They actually need more help than that. 18 is actually fairly young. And so a lot of homeless youth are 18 and over. And if you don't have anyone to help you go to school, it's hard. One young man that I saw, he was just a regular white working class North Seattle kid, but he was gay. And his brother repeatedly beat him up. And at one point he put him in the hospital, and his brother came to the hospital and said to him, "You can't come home. If you come home next time, you will not live to be in the hospital. So don't come home again." So he tried to talk to his mother, and his mother said to him, "If you weren't so blatant, it wouldn't bug your brother so much." He was like, "I had no choice. All I wanted to do was just go to school, finish high school, go to college. That was it. That was all. I have no, great issues, but I couldn't. I had to become homeless because I couldn't live at home." And And I've had quite a few colleagues who've had the same experience. One of the PAs that I've worked with, he was growing up in Ohio. He came out to his mother. She said, "You can't live here anymore." And he was underage and he didn't know what to do. He went to his coach. He said, "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do." And the coach said, "Well, I only have a very small apartment, but you can sleep in my pantry." And so for like 3 or 4 months, he slept in the pantry of his coach's apartment. And, you know, he eventually got other services, and he eventually went to college, and then he got a master's degree, and, you know, he works hard. But it's really difficult for people who just lose that family support, you know. And it's very hard to make your way as a young person without that support. The thing about the morning paper that was really good was that they talked about the fact that homelessness is really in all areas. So there's rural homelessness, there's suburban homelessness, there's urban homelessness, and it exists everywhere. And everyone's story is a little bit different, you know. So there are always individual factors. Some people are more resilient than others. They happen to have a coach or somebody that will take care of them. My partner is a judge, and for many years she worked in juvenile court as a defense attorney. And there was this really, really young person. So many homeless youth become homeless at like 11 or 12. One young woman I knew, she was originally, her family was Aleutian, and her mother said to her when she was 12, "You're now an adult." That's what we think in this culture. Partly it's because the life expectancy of people, particularly Native people in Alaska, is not commonly beyond 45. So, you know, in her village culture, 12 was considered an adult. And so her mother said, "So you're on your own. Go out there and take care of yourself." And there are very few ways for underage youth to earn money. And they need money because they need to eat. And they get involved with exchanging sex for food, sex for shelter, sex for money or drugs. And it's really sexual exploitation, and it is not that they want to become professionals in this area. They are living day to day, and there are many times where somebody will say, "Well, you could sleep at my place," and then the youth finds out that this person thinks that that means that they should have sex with them because they're feeding them and letting them sleep at their house that night. So there's a lot of issues around how they can protect themselves and not be victimized. There's a lot of issues around sexually transmitted illnesses and mental illnesses. It's very traumatic, so a lot of them have post-traumatic stress, which they can't really do deep therapy on until they are stably housed. There are transitional houses for youth, for adults, for women and children, and people that get into the shelter system are really lucky. Some of those shelters, like the single adult shelters, are like this huge room with mats. That's not as great as having a place that you can lock your door and sleep without hearing everyone around you and not worrying about your possessions and so on. But there's a lot of effort that goes into trying to provide some kind of safe housing for all these people on the street. But the need for affordable housing is been going on for a long time, and the city has engaged in a lengthy process where they've taken all of the low-income areas, housing developments from the 70s, and torn them down and made them into mixed-use housing. And so the theory used to be that, you know, you would build these low-income housing things and house all these people. And then they decided that it wasn't a good environment, that it was better for people to live in a less economically segregated area, that there was more problems with drugs and crime and so on. So they changed all those to the new Holly, and they're currently building the new Yesler and High Point, and there were 5 or 6 large housing developments that have now been converted into this new mixed-use thing. So that means that only half of the houses are people able to live in who don't have market rate incomes. And the market rate in Seattle is $600,000 for the average single-family home. And many of my graduates at Med have said, I have a good job, my husband has a good job, and we can barely afford to get a house here. So they have reduced by 50% the really low-income housing. And they have not found effective ways to replace that housing. So number one, homelessness is structural in that it's very hard for people to earn enough to live in housing. Housing is very expensive, and there isn't enough low-income housing being built. But the other factors also have to do with educational things. A lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't finish school have very poor outcomes in terms of being able to afford to get a good job and to qualify for the kinds of things that you need in order to advance. And the thing is that people think that homeless people don't work. Actually, most homeless people who are over 18 can work, and they do work. They often are underemployed, they don't earn enough, they can't get full-time work, and there's also this very strange thing that has happened with the economic terrain for low-income workers, and that is that Burger King and McDonald's and Wendy's have these do not compete clauses that they make their employees sign. So they may not be getting full-time work from one employer, but they have to sign this thing that says that they won't work for one of the competitors to get 2 jobs so that they can have a full-time employment. So there's so many different aspects to this. So the high incarceration rate for minorities, particularly African Americans, but all minorities have more police contact and more police incidents than mainstream white Americans do, statistically speaking. And they are a higher percentage of homeless individuals because they don't have family wealth to fall back on. Another structural aspect of that is that when Black people who've been excluded from a certain housing market move into that market, or other minorities, the housing values go down, whereas in other areas, the housing values go up, so that when you pass on your house to your kid, there is more money, not less. Whereas in minority neighborhoods, often the home values are less, so that you're not actually passing on wealth. So that's another of the sort of structural things, the way the whole housing market is, the disaster of the subprime mortgages, the way that our educational system does not prepare people for the world that we live in, that requires good education, multilingual, high competency in areas of technical and other kinds of expertise. We aren't turning those people out of our high schools. That's not what's coming out. And so there are many systems that are involved here. And as we work in the health field, we see primarily people who come through that pipeline, and we also see people who failed to come through that pipeline. And you know, the average homeless person has not seen a dentist in over 10 years. They tend to go to an emergency room for care, not where you need to get your care, especially with chronic illness. And as people age, so of the older homeless, many of them are veterans. Vietnam War veterans are one of the largest groups of older homeless individuals in this country. And they have a lot of chronic illnesses. They have hypertension, they have diabetes, they have hepatitis, and they need good primary care, and they need good dental care, and it's really hard for them to get that. So children have the best access to dental care because they're covered. But even that's hard. I mean, when the ACA came in, like, all these people finally had insurance. But then they had to find someone that would take their insurance. Lots of places won't take Medicaid. Lots of orthopedists, lots of diabetes specialists, lots of private hospitals will not take that kind of insurance. So even people who are newly covered still have access issues. And the distribution of care is still a major problem. So homelessness is something that you will see wherever you are. Homeless people, you know, are here at the university, they are in public schools, they are at events that you will go to, and you don't know that. The newspaper article this morning went on at some length about how much families try to hide their homelessness from the other people at the school, except for like 1 or 2 people, because of the shame, because people feel that they have failed, that they are losers, that they are failures in the eyes of others. They don't necessarily think of themselves, I think many of them see themselves as survivors. One man that I worked with for a long time had, both his parents died when he was very young in a car accident. And he was raised by an aunt and uncle who had 4 or 5 other children. And he was pretty much just the extra kid. And he ended up working in a number of different places. He was in Alaska. He had a long career, but he used drugs. And he finally got to a certain age and he said, I'm going to stop using drugs now. And he came here and I saw him at the clinic for quite a few years. And he totally turned his life around and became a person who finally was able to claim his life. But he was a person who had never been nurtured by anyone. He had the hardest time bonding with anyone. He had the hardest time trusting anyone because he was basically an abandoned child. And no one really ever said, your life is important. You have value. And that's one of the most important things you can do when you are in a situation where you might be seeing a person who is in a very hard place or at a very hard time, is just to say, it's great that you came in. I'm happy to see you. We want you to be as healthy as you can be. Just any kind of simple, affirming thing is very therapeutic as a provider for your patient. regardless of what you're seeing them for. If you make them feel heard and seen, this is very good for them. One time when I was at the clinic, we got a call from the front desk that said, anyone from youth clinic, please come down, there's somebody here. So sometimes it's that somebody's making a donation or something, but it was this young woman, and she said, 10 years ago, I was in a terrible place. I was very sick, I had no money, I didn't know what to do, and I came here, and you treated me like a human being. And it really changed my life. Now I'm married, I've been to college, my husband and I have a house, and we have a baby, and it started here. It started when you treated me like a human being, and you saw me. So that's the most important thing you can do. Thank you.